AskReddit by Joel Snowes. What's the craziest WW2 fact that you know of? The nuclear attack on Nagasaki almost failed when the bomb plane got separated from their escorts and they wasted 45 minutes of fuel trying to find them. Should also be noted the original target city was Kokura for the second bomb, but smoke from previous bombing runs, fires and cloud cover. They tried 3 times but could not see their target. With fuel running low, they decided to proceed to back up target of Nagasaki, which also had increased cloud cover, but on the last pass before having to return to base they had a just clear enough window to drop it. It still ended up 2 miles off course, and while still devastating, the natural hills protected a big chunk of the city. The first bomb dropped on Hiroshima was only off by 800 feet and absolutely decimated the city. After Germany invaded France, they forced Citroën to make trucks for them. In an act of sabotage, Citroën moved the full mark on the engine oil dipstick lower. So, the engines would run but fail under heavy use. Brilliant. Similarly, when the guys in Seattle were building Me-262 jet replicas, they had some genuine parts to use as patterns. One guy told me he disassembled a nose gear leg to see its inner workings and found a deliberate machining fault that would have, with continued use, eventually worn through and collapsed the oleo. The forced labor machinists doing what little things they could get away with to show defiance. My dad and his brother, Dan, ran into each other randomly in France. They turned around and saw each other, and they both yelled, "What are you doing here?" I have a couple of photos from that day. They got to spend that day together before going back into hell, and they both survived the war. Seeing someone you know from home while abroad, in the military, is a wild experience. I can't imagine seeing a brother in between trips through hell. Klaus Helberg, a Norwegian who took part in Operation Gunnerside to blow up the German heavy water plant, part of their atomic weapon program, had a several-hour-long ski chase with German soldiers afterwards, exchanging gunfire with his pursuers. He then skied off of a cliff, broke his arm and skied another 12 miles to a German field hospital. Despite still wearing British uniform, he convinced them that he was in fact on their side and received medical treatment. The Germans then put him up in a nice hotel to rest. However, a German SS commander had a hissy fit after a local woman in the hotel refused to sleep with him, so had everyone in the hotel rounded up and sent to a concentration camp. Helberg jumped out of the bus that was carrying the man, despite being hit in the back with a grenade, as in, it bounced off of his back, and breaking his arm again. He managed to escape and was a leading member of the Norwegian resistance. I see where half all James Bond movies got their ideas from. In France, my uncle Curtis got blown up but still alive, so they find him really good and buried him in the sand till the battle moved on, then they came back and got him. He's still kicking. Here's an article about him, Ingwe All Black Tank Battle HTML. Holy shit, I've never heard that. But it makes sense. The beaches were hell zones, no cover. Might as well bury him and hope you get back before high tide. That time the British dumped a dead man's body with fake plans planted on him so it would wash up in Spain and get turned over to the Germans. Operation Mincemeat for anyone that wants to learn more. Unbelievably meticulous. That Hitler only joined the Nazi party because the German army sent him to a beating to basically spy on them. Someone was giving a speech suggesting Bavaria should leave Germany and join Austria. Hitler was enraged by this and went on a rant about why that was a bad idea. The other members were impressed and recruited him to join the party, and the rest is history. He also quickly realized how valuable he was to them because of his oratory skills and charisma. He was an outstanding recruiter. So at one point he threatened to leave and join another party if he wasn't given leadership. They had no choice. Hitler wasn't just some dude who happened to be at the head of the Nazis, he really was a huge part of the reason everything happened as an individual. Ian Kershaw's biographies of Hitler are really great, as well as Richard Evans' Third Reich trilogy, although that's more about Nazi Germany as a whole rather than just Hitler for anyone interested. Of course, Hitler is one of the most written about subjects in history, so there's countless books. Those are just ones I think highly of. A member of the US Navy survived being stabbed 4 times by Japanese bayonets during the Bataan Death March when he was a POW in the Philippines. He buried a spoon in the ground before the march started that he promised he'd come back and retrieve when the war was over to prove he survived. In 1946, he returned to the Philippines and dug up the spoon to bring home. That man was my great uncle, and my family still has that spoon 82 years later. Not the most crazy WWII fact, but it's one that's personal to my family. That's awesome. My family has a metal chalice from my great uncle at Normandy. He picked it up after the fight was over. He scratched his name, date, and location on it, and brought it back with him. He never married and it passed to my dad. The United States had 2 freshwater aircraft carriers. Got a train carrier pilot somewhere, might as well use the Great Lakes. Bear with me on this one. In 1942, a company of Polish troops were evacuated from the Soviet Union and found their way to Iran. Along the way, they befriended a Syrian brown bear that they named Wojtek. They officially enlisted him as a private in the unit. The men ended up in Italy from 1943-44, bringing the bear along with them. It helped to carry heavy ammunition and quickly became a celebrity among the troops. Wojtek was eventually discharged after the war and lived peacefully in Edinburgh Zoo until he passed away in 1963. Don't forget that they paid him in cigarettes. And his army buddies would come visit him at the zoo. A French-Canadian soldier named Leo Major was so pissed off at the Germans for killing one of his friends he single-handedly rounded up 93 Germans and liberated a Dutch town. He kept bringing back prisoners, grabbed some ammo, and went back, alone, to capture more. He also only had one eye. When he was to be awarded the Legion of Merit Medal, he refused because the officer who recommended him wasn't a Canadian. During the war, Canada built more military trucks than the major Axis powers, Germany, Japan, Italy, combined. Source: https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/Canadian_military_pattern_truck . The mighty and technologically unparalleled German army was mostly supplied by horse-drawn wagons. And that was after stealing every car and truck in the occupied countries. In the UK, when war was declared, the government encouraged people to give their pets away, or put them to sleep. People did this without being encouraged because there was a fear there wouldn't be enough food to feed their families and their pets. Everything in the British Isles was rationed, and U-boats were sinking some of the cargo ships that were coming in. Farm boys were all being drafted, and the average people were encouraged to grow victory gardens. The British had to feed crews of their ships all over the world, and entire armies in Egypt and other places. It was all controlled. Pet food was most likely to be last on the list of priorities. Something like 1/10 of the Russian population died. More like 1/7. Joe Medicine Crow. The last war chief of the Crow Nation. During WW2 he completed all 4 tasks required to be a war chief. Touching an enemy without killing him, taking an enemy's weapon, leading a successful war party, and stealing an enemy's horse. He led a successful war party and stole 50 horses owned by the Waffen-SS from a German camp, singing a traditional crow on a song as he rode off, awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom and Bronze Star. Went on to be a tribal spokesman and obviously the Crow Nation war chief until his death in 2016. If Tyler Sheridan needs a new Western war show idea, this is it. https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/Joe. It's not on the wiki, but in the History on Fire podcast episode about him it's mentioned that his nephew, I think, almost repeated the feat in Vietnam, but there were no horses to steal. My grandfather had 10 rounds left when Patton broke through at Bastogne. I meet a few veterans that were in the Battle of the Bulge. One fellow was so hungry when they gave him an orange, he ate it peel and all. I watched a documentary of a guy who wanted to be a spy and ended up somehow getting one of the highest medals on the German side and one of the highest medals in the Allied side also. Supposedly the only person to do so. Codename L = World War II. He was just a guy who wanted to be a spy, so he offered MI6's services and was turned down. So he started spying for the Germans and feeding them false intel to prove to the British he could do it. The 8th Air Force suffered more casualties than the Marine Corps. This was going to be one of mine. Basically the bomber cruise over Europe took more casualties than the US in the Pacific. My great uncle was in the Navy serving in the Pacific assigned to an oiler. He happened to be on another ship for whatever reason during a Japanese attack and his ship was sunk. His family heard of his ship being sunk and had heard nothing from him, so they assumed he had been killed. My great uncle Roby, whom I remember very fondly, wrote a letter to his sister or mother at some point, probably months later, not knowing that the family had assumed his death, and that's how they found out he was still alive. I have pictures of his return home in his Navy uniform on my wall. He once told me something as a child that has become very important to me since. He said to me, "Always be man enough to be who you are." He came home with some cool souvenirs, one of which I have. It's a copy of Stars and Stripes dating the 14th of August 1945. The day that the Japanese formally surrendered. Rest in peace, Uncle Roby. In the last days of the war, a tank repair crew was called out to look at a Sherman. They arrived at a tank with dozens of machine gun bullets stuck in the armor, which is surprising since they should have bounced off. They inspected the tank and checked the serial number to confirm, but turns out on D-Day this tank crew had been issued a training tank which had much thinner armor. They immediately started to get a replacement tank for the crew and they refused, saying it had gotten them this far. Another one I love is about a British agent dropped in France with a bike and radio. He's pedaling to where he's supposed to meet his contact, and upon turning a bend he comes face to face with a German roadblock. Too late to turn back, he goes up to the stop and when asked what was in his pack he says, "A radio, I'm a British agent." The Germans have a good laugh and wave him through. First one happened more than once. In the early 2000s the US Army asked to exchange a commemorative Sherman from a Belgian community, parked there for 55 years, against a battle-worn Sherman Air from the Army collections. Turned out the thing had been one of a few prototypes sent into combat during the Battle of the Bulge and was never properly evaluated. Better late than never. Japanese mini-subs were at the attack of Pearl Harbor. Japanese mini-subs attacked Sydney in Australia. They caused a small amount of havoc and sunk a ferry, but none of them ever made it back. The last Japanese soldiers didn't surrender until the mid-1970s. https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/iru. His commander, I have to what? Oh, for fuck's sake, he was always one to take this a little too serious. They tried to make an aircraft carrier made of ice. Technically picrete, sawdust or wood pulp and ice. Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish national that wanted to spy for Britain against Germany. Britain rejected his offer, but he decided to spy for them anyway. Pop some popcorn and read his wiki. During the Battle of Samar, a part of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a small task force of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts codenamed Taffy 3 were attacked by the Japanese Center Fleet, which consisted of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. This was the only time the battleship Yamato engaged enemy surface vessels. The battle was absurdly one-sided for the Japanese. The battleship Yamato alone had a higher displacement than all of Taffy 3 combined. After a long battle against absolutely stacked odds, the small American task force managed to force the Center Fleet to retreat and saved all the vulnerable landing craft of the Leyte Gulf invasion. If they made a movie out of it, no one would believe it. The bombers launched every piece of ordnance they had, and when they ran out of those they'd make fake attack runs and strafe the ships with gunfire. The ship's gunners throwing every type of shell they had, even their illumination shells. The engineers bypassing the safeties on the boilers to get the ship to go as fast as possible. Those ships didn't just save the landing beaches and the escort carriers, they straight up earned a tactical victory. Just look at the ships sunk and the casualties. It's just insane that it actually happened.